Thank you, Martin, for the kind introduction and for mentioning that I have been in that graduate school a couple of years ago, which came to my mind when I saw that it's the last annual conference, and I said, oh, I should have been one of the first speakers. This was not in this room, and I'm particularly happy to be here. So, ladies and gentlemen, the moment my hands received a very well done poster announcing this 5th annual conference of the Graduate School for East and Southeast European Studies, I immediately knew what I would say first in my keynote. As I pinned the poster to my door at my GWZO, we are still calling us GWZO, in Leipzig, and gassed up on the title of my talk, which I had given by phone to Caroline Fricke, I realized it is lacking a question mark. This is important, since my intention today is not to offer a refined instruction manual on how to study Eastern Europe as a global area. I rather want to share with you my reflections on the overall topic and outline possible, will be 3 research fields which empirically prove the globality of the region. Area studies, and this is the topic of this conference, emerged at 2 particular moments. First, in the history of higher education in the US, namely at the end of World War I, with courses on regions not very well known when troops were sent out to faraway battlefields. Second, in the first half of the 1940s, when the US military prepared for the intervention into World War II. We can conclude that the definition of area studies is part of an exercise in both intellectually and militarily defining a global order and to position different regions into that order. This way, of course, not specific for North American interventions into the knowledge order of areas, but can be observed with developing regional studies in Central and Western Europe since the 18th century, and also with the emerging interest in other regions among Eastern European societies. Recent research by my younger Leipzig colleagues Thorsten Loschke, Katja Naumann and Steffi Marum on area studies in several parts of the world, in the US, Germany, France, as well as in East Central and Eastern Europe, demonstrate this similarity very well. Conducting area studies contributes to the establishment of hierarchies in the world, to the legitimization of new power asymmetries, and to processes of space reformation through the dissolution of empires, the establishment of nation-states, networks, value chains, and much more. These processes are not only and quite often not primarily imposed from outside by external forces. On the contrary, positioning and being positioned go permanently hand in hand. My point of departure is the assumption that in Eastern Europe societies try to define their own way of positioning themselves and what they perceive as globalization. In this perspective, efforts in coming to terms with the global condition as emerged by the revolution of transport and media during the second half of the 19th century are to be considered as important driving forces for political, economic, and cultural development in the region. Such an approach goes along the lines of Doreen Massey's Imagining Globalization, in which she stresses the nexus between being passively globalized and actively contributing to global processes. And it acknowledges Benno Verlin's concept of gesellschaftliche Räumlichkeit which underlines the importance of local connections to a globalized world. In this respect, ladies and gentlemen, Eastern Europe is to be understood as a globalized and a globalizing region. The international debate on the history and the current of globalization brought to the fore that it was not and is not a somehow natural process, being mainly of economic character, having started in the global north and expanding from there to other world regions. Globalization, as we investigated in the context of the Leipzig Research Cluster being formed by the University, the GWZO, and the Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography, is rather a bundle of political projects which, with different range, attractiveness, and power to link actors and institutions within a changing world order. Consequently, here is not one, but there are many globalizations which are related to in one way or another. And these globalization projects reach into different directions and differently far. Therefore, we work with the term transregional, as done so in the Handbook of Transregional Studies currently in print with Routledge. To insist on the fact that global doesn't mean necessarily planetarian, but addresses the quality of transcending the borders of a single world region. As to the region in question here at this conference, from an epistemological point of view, it has been argued that there is hardly a consensus found as to what and who Eastern Europe is and what and who Eastern Europe is not, who belongs to the region and who does not, who is defined by whom as Eastern European. Regarding the latter, there is no doubt that this is pretty much a German business, since we tend to distinguish östliches Europa from Osteuropa, have in use analytically as well as institutionally Ostmitteleuropa, Südosteuropa, partly Ostmitteleuropa, Nordosteuropa. Tomasz Zaritsky generally reflects on the issue in his Ideologies of Eastness in Central and Eastern Europe from 2014. As for our Leibniz Science Campus, Eastern Europe Global Area, active since 2016, we see Eastern Europe as a spatial institutional frame in which projects of globalization are created and a stage on which such projects are performed. Any endeavor to describe and to explain the globality of Eastern Europe is confronted with the state of research so far determined by plenty of studies about globalization projects by North American and Western European actors, while Eastern European actors are often neglected. As an overarching topic that helps to overcome this imbalance, I have singled out the question of how actors in Eastern Europe reacted to and took position and part in the manifold processes of colonization and decolonization in the world outside of Europe. In dealing with this topic, I will take a triple look back. First, to the situation after World War I, when Eastern Europe was reshaped under the auspices of the principle of nationality. Second, to the situation around 1900, when Eastern Europe was part of an imperial setting. And third, to the situation in the 1950s and 60s, when Eastern Europe was part of the so-called Eastern Bloc. Before doing so, however, in the first part of my lecture, I want to tackle the position of Eastern Europe in the dichotomy of two concepts, which determined the world under the Cold War condition, the concept of three worlds versus the concept of a competition between two world systems. In the last part of my lecture, I will shortly reflect Eastern Europe's position in the concept of global moments as coined for 1980-19 and 1989. My first point, Eastern Europe and the concept of three worlds versus a competition between two world systems. To explain the order of post-World War II global power arrangements, the East-West axis was the most prominent one. For 4 decades, it connected the Kremlin and the White House and lost its relevance right after the Cold War ended. At this moment, the term globalization quickly gained prominence. Post-colonial studies emerged, entered many disciplines, subaltern studies grew, and area studies revitalized significantly. All that happened in the aftermath of the 1989 revolutions in Eastern Europe. The subsequent breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991 created a post-war global constellation that, farther on, was interpreted along the north-south axis. This evident change of the general perspective towards the relations between the global north and the global south caused attraction in historical and social as well as in political and economic sciences. Within this setting, we can observe several trends concerning the history of the global Cold War. A, the East was often overlooked as an actor belonging to the global North. B, in the global South, the decolonized Third World became problematized as an invention of the West, like Christoph Calder showed in his Entdeckung der dritten Welt. C, the East, in retrospect, now was often called the Second World, while D, the term First World, for the West, is still very seldom in use. In the 1990s, a strong hope was articulated that the end of the East-West conflict would lead to one united world instead of three worlds. My daughters, born a few years before in Berlin the wall came down, were taught along this line. A textbook produced in the United Germany opened with a chapter on how to learn to understand the one world. The first sentence read like this: the world of today is closely entangled. The repetition into a first, second, and third world is over. On the next page, however, the headline, "One world instead of three worlds," is followed by a question mark. And the text starts by stating that the end of the East-West conflict did not end the repetition of the world, but made it porous. No further word about the first world, but a clear statement concerning the second world, explained in brackets as the former bloc of socialist states, which does not exist anymore. And as to the third world, explained as developing countries, my kids learned that as the unit, it did exist at most in the final phase of the colonial times. A comparison with textbooks in Eastern Europe made at the same moment seems to be worse. As far as Eastern Europe's position in the Cold War order was concerned and is concerned, both historians and contemporary observers have been inclined to look along the East-West axis. No doubt, to take such a perspective on the Cold War focused on the superpower relations, its arms race leading to the threat of a nuclear overkill, have had good reasons. Libraries are filled with books on the Soviet-American relations between 1947 and 1991, books like Tony McAleaver's Superpower Rivalry, a Cold War, published in 1998. It took some time until scholars at several places started to expand the scope on the Cold War, to literally globalize it, like Odd Arne Westad did in his path-breaking monograph, The Global Cold War of 2005, or like a whole team of historians did in the 3 volumes of the Cambridge History of the Cold War of 2012. They covered almost all wars, often civil and mostly hot wars during the Cold War around the globe. Local wars in the Third World, which became proxy conflicts of the superpower. A growing set of studies directly focused on the relations between the socialist and the developing countries, produced accompanying works. I should mention at least the studies of David Angerman, The Second World's Third World of 2011, or Sara Lorenzini's on the Comecon, and The South meant as East-South Economic Relations of 2014, and newer works. That works have in common, what they have in common is that they pay special attention to the multiple challenges and processes of decolonization coursed in Eastern Europe, what these processes coursed in Eastern Europe. A big challenge was the Third World concept itself. It was not easy to accept in the East because it offered an option outside the scheme of the 2 world systems, capitalism and socialism. For this reason, the very term Third World was not officially used in the socialist world. Instead, countries becoming independent and emerging from the decolonization process were called either young national states or developing countries. The latter term became predominant during the 1970s for the underdeveloped countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. In East Germany, 1972, Zentraler Rat für Asien, Afrika und Lateinamerika-Wissenschaften in der DDR, that's the full title, was formed, which published a scientific journal which the initials of the 3 continents in its title, AALA. Also surviving until 2002, AALA did not concur a fixed position in the field of the fast-growing area studies. As a source, however, for the history of knowledge production, we have been talking about knowledge production on the Third World in Eastern Europe, the journal, which twice a year was published in English, is still of importance. From the beginning on, it contained articles by researchers from all socialist countries working throughout the region in national research institutes on Africa, Asia, and Latin America, often founded in the early 60s. Browsing the tables of content, one indeed hardly comes across the words Third World. Concerning a general use of the term in Eastern Europe, Sara Lorenzini argued that it was fully abundant in the second half of the 1970s when other formulas prevailed. The handful of Soviet publications she mentions containing the term Third World on book covers are seen by her as exceptions from the rule, as a sign of détente. A closer look, however, to other socialist countries shows a different picture. In Hungary, from 1974 on, developmental problems of decolonized countries were increasingly discussed under the label Harmadik Világ, which means in Hungarian the Third World. Romania declared itself to be a developing country all by the socialist movement in 1972. President Nicolae Ceausescu visited Africa 6 times until 1980 and presented his country as a fellow third world state. In 1976, Romania attained observer status within the group of 77. These were the new developing states. Thus, Eastern Europe's position towards the decolonized world proves to be fragmented. And this, ladies and gentlemen, again puts into question the general notion of a supposedly monolithic Eastern Bloc. The latest issue of the journal 20th Century Communism announced last Monday, earlier this week, at Hazard's Kult, and dedicated to the relations of communist states and post-war Africa, post-Second World War Africa, offers brand new research in that respect. Another major challenge for the socialist states in Eastern Europe being confronted with decolonization in the South had to do with the Sino-Soviet competition for the Third World. Jeremy Friedman called it a shadow Cold War in the title of his 2015 monograph. For the upcoming volume, Alternative Globalizations, Eastern Europe and the Post-Colonial World, currently under preparation by James Mark, University of Exeter, Steffi Marung and Artemy Kalinowski. In that volume, the Hungarian sinologist Peter Vámos sketches the Chinese three-world concept in the years of Mao's global open-up policy. In Beijing's view, the First World was formed by imperialists in the north. That means the US and the Soviet Union. The Second World was comprised of developed, respectively industrialized countries of the West and the East. To the Third World belonged underdeveloped peasant, respectively rural, countries in the South, including China. In 1979, a leading party official from Moscow reacted to the Chinese position in very sharp words, and I quote, "It is of immense importance for a successful and consistent struggle for a genuine democratization of international economic relations that the countries in the socialist community, like many developing countries, should refute the false Maoist notion of world partition into North and South, into rich and poor countries. This has to be replaced by the scientifically grounded notion of the partition of the world into two social systems." End of quote. As contributions to a special issue of the Jahrbuch für historische Kommunismusforschung is forthcoming next year demonstrate, the quarrel was long-lasting. For more than 2 decades, Chinese and Soviet leaders fought for support of their respective positions. And due to the lack of resources offered by Mao's China often, the Soviet Union prevailed, since leaders from North Korean Kim Il-sung to the Vietnamese party officials were first and foremost in support of their own developmental goals, be it in form of weapons for warfare against external intervention, be it in form of technologies for the advancement of their domestic economies. This started to change in early 1980s, and one may wonder if today's growing influence of China has its roots in the self-presentations it established during the Sino-Soviet split. My second point, shifting perceptions, colonialism and decolonialism in Eastern European perspectives. It is common sense that decolonization and the dismantlement of empires are two sides of the same coin. Thus, many analyses of decolonizing processes need needs to study the history of post-imperial settings. This has been widely done for post-World War II decolonization concerning the decline of the Western European colonial powers, for the British in India and the Dutch in the West Indies in the late 40s, for the French in Algeria in the 1950s, for France and the UK plus Belgium and Africa in the 1960s, and finally for Portugal and in Angola and Mozambique in the 1970s. For my topic today, a reflection back on the decline of empires after World War I is important, since Eastern Europe in 1918-1919 was totally reshaped by the creation of independent states. A renewed Poland, a new Czechoslovakia, the old but considerably reduced Hungary were situated on territories that before belonged to the Russian, German, Austro-Hungarian empires. How and in this post-World War I setting was Eastern Europe touched by the colonial question is a research question that can be discussed through three examples. First, Germany, the only of the three named empires which had overseas colonies, lost them all with the Peace Conference. Poland, having gained access to the Baltic Sea, was eager to access some of the German overseas possessions. The argument made in Warsaw was the following: 1/6 of the Poland state territory before 1918 was part of Germany, thus 1/6 of the former German colonies would have been handed over to Poland, what the peacemakers in Paris certainly refused. But the Polish desire for having colonies lived on. The Liga Morska i Koloniali, Maritime and Colonial League, founded in 1924 and growing until World War II to a 1 million member organization, 1 million member organization, which was made by recruiting all pupils in all schools throughout the country. But this league became a visible social backbone of the Polish colonial dream. In Poznan, still in 1938, at a manifestation, people were marching behind a banner stating the power of Poland lays in colonies. Sila Polska leży w kolonii. A year later, however, Poland became the first victim of Hitler's war to gain world power. Second, in Prague, the capital of a landlocked Czechoslovakian republic, the possession of colonies was seen very desirable. Alois Musil, prior to the war called the Czech Lawrence of Arabia, acting during the war as Secretary General of the Austrian Oriental and Overseas Society, and becoming after the war a professor of New Arabic Languages at the Charles University in Prague, Musil put it that way, and I quote: only the Orient may us compensate the colonies we do not have, but we will need. We are and we will be an industrialized state. We need countries where to export our goods and others from where we import raw materials. The West, in fact he called it the West, will offer us more than it will buy from us, and raw materials from there for sure will not be cheap. Thus it remains us only the Orient and the world. With a direct reference to the French model, at the turn of 1919-1920, the Prague professor argued for the creation of an Oriental Institute for scientific research that would support economic penetration into the Arab world within Asia Minor, known to the Europeans as the Middle East. The institute in Prague was shaped with great governmental subsidies by the end of the 1920s, and 30 years later, reacting on the decolonization process in Africa, the Oriental Institute became the leading center for African studies in socialist Czechoslovakia. My third example. Also Hungary was a landlocked country, a kingdom without a king but ruled by an admiral. Yes, the dual monarchy has had its navy, including submarines, and Miklos Horthy used to serve at the Adriatic, and he became the regent. The colonial question as tackled in Budapest was not only the expression of a political dream to rule over the Carpathian Basin, but at the same time a reflection what was going on in the then contemporary world. In 1928, the Társadalmi Lexikon, the social encyclopedia, contained an article on colonial policy of our times, to be distinguished from pre-capitalist times. Nowadays, and this was stated a decade after World War I, and I quote, the exploited proletariat of the colonies, hand in hand with the exploited labor in the mother countries, is fighting for the elimination of imperialism, end of quote. This was no doubt a clear communist rhetoric, and in fact the author Josef Magyar, under the Horthy regime, emigrated to the Soviet Union, where in 1936 he fell victim to Stalinist purges. As different as the perceptions might have been on colonialism in Eastern Europe during the interwar period, they seem to be quite similar before World War I and were so after World War II. To prove my assumption, on the one hand, I took a look into the entries colony in the biggest Czech and Hungarian encyclopedias around 1900. On the other hand, into the entries colonialism in Polish and Hungarian and dilemma colonial system of imperialism in East German encyclopedias of the early 1960s. Around 1900, that means in the midst of the high time of imperialist colonialism in Prague as in Budapest, authors highlighted the economic advantages of colonial possessions. Thus, contemporary readers easily could get the impression that having colonies is simply a normal thing and a good thing. In the high time of decolonization in the 1960s in Warsaw, Budapest, and East Berlin, the colonial system was already described as falling apart. No question, Polish, Hungarian, and East German authors for sure did so under the impression of the 11 pages long article Colony in the 1953 edition of the Great Soviet Encyclopedia. Along the Moscow guideline, they all stressed A, the importance of the great socialist October Revolution of 1917, which overthrew the inner colonialism of the Tsars in Russia. B, the importance of Asia, marked by the formation of the People's Republic of China, 53, was this quote, the People's Democratic Republic of Korea and the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. And C, the victory of the Soviet Union in World War II, followed by the rise of socialist states in Eastern Europe. According to Hungary's UI lexicon of 1960, UI means new, the socialist world system, and I quote, unlike the imperialists, provided altruistic economic and political support to the countries that have become independent. In Meyers Neues Lexikon, Leipzig, 1962, the respective article and the definite the article ended with a clear optimistic statement. The total breakdown of colonialism and the definite national and social liberation of the peoples of the currently still colonial and dependent countries is unavoidable. Interestingly enough, only the Polish Great General Encyclopedia of 1965 speaks explicitly about decolonization. We read that the process of decolonization entered his decisive phase during World War II and immediately after, to be seen first in Asia, named India, Indonesia, China, followed later on by anti-colonial uprisings in many other countries, eventually leading to a complete breakdown of the colonial system. Roughly half a century after the Eastern European encyclopedias dealt with colonialism, as just shown, in the Oxford Handbook of the Ends, in plural, of empire, in singular, an article was published on Eastern Europe, which is accessible online since January 2018. James Mark and Quinn Slobodian here pretend, and I quote them, to place Eastern Europe into a larger history of decolonization by focusing on both the domestic end of empires after World War I and the relationship of communist Eastern European states to Africa and Asia during the dissolution of overseas European empires from 1945 to 1976, end of quote. In the introduction to the article, we learn that communists hardly ever used the term decolonization, which in fact is not the case if we look only alone to the Polish encyclopedia I quoted a minute ago. It has been argued that decolonization was a Western term invented to hide the conflicts behind and stress the generous nature of handover of power. Mark and Slobodian take this for granted and announce that the very term decolonization was first used in English in the 1930s to connect, listen, the already achieved independence of states in Eastern Europe with the argument about the inevitability of the liberation of nations in colonized Africa and Asia in the near future. End of quote. In my own research on Eastern Europe perceptions, I have looked back to 1900, and I must confess I'm not convinced neither by the idea to claim the end of empires in 1918, Eastern Europe as the first site of decolonization, nor by the idea to draw close analogies between the end of the empires in Eastern Europe after World War I and in the global South during the Cold War. But I haven't consulted yet Stuart Ward's text, The European Provenance of Decolonization, published in Past and Present, in the meantime 2 years ago, from which both ideas apparently are taken for the Oxford Handbook of the Ends of Empire. And in fact, ladies and gentlemen, decolonization started as early as 1776 in North America, when the United States were shaped, went on 1791 in San Domingo, later known as Haiti, and 1815 onwards in Latin America. In respect to Eastern Europe, I should add that in 1799, Poles actually were involved in Napoleon's all but unsuccessful attempt of recolonization in the Caribbean. My last point, Eastern Europe and the concept of global moments. To think, talk, and write about global moments in world history became popular in the course of the increased interest in global history I mentioned in the beginning of my lecture. If global history is understood as the history of the global in the world, several global moments may be singled out alone in the 20th century. Ewald Fried, in his recent essay 100 Jahre 1918-19 for Zeithistorische Forschungen, contributed to the debate. According to him, the Great War became a world war, not due to the fact that battles were fought all over the world, but by the fact that people all over the world directed their actions and linked their aims along the line of a constellation of events, Ereigniskonstellation, caused by the war. Also, as he admits, a worldwide Diskursgemeinschaft possibly did not exist, Free speaks about a struggle for post-European futures, in plural, to be noticed in different places around the world. And in this sense, the global interaction of 1918-1919 made the end of World War I a global moment. In Leipzig, roughly a decade ago, we discussed the issue while drafting a conference and putting together the volume Martin Schulze-Wessel just mentioned, 1989 in the Global Perspective. In those days, the international discourse was still determined by the notion of 1989 being a moment of catching up revolution for Western modernity. Our intention was to direct the focus on the question as to what extent 1989 might be interpreted as a caesura which changed the world in general. Based on our debates, my colleague Matthias Smidell suggested to discuss a global moment in theoretical terms in three variations. First, events of peculiar importance, often noticed by contemporaries, like, for instance, Hegel concerning the French Revolution because it changed the whole world. Second, events which are globally remembered, or at least of importance for large parts of the population worldwide, due to their historical self-perception, such as World War I or II. Third, a temporarily dense, if not synchronous, observation of shocks, instability of societies and or states caused by revolutions, rebellions, wars, coups d'etats, and public unrest, which leads contemporaries and ex-post observers towards the idea that such an unusual cluster of crises in different countries and world regions during a short period of time might be an indicator for a long-term transformation process. Also stressing continuities rather than changes, George Lawson, in his introduction to the volume The Global 1989, edited with Chris Armbruster and Michael Cox in 2010, rightly underlined that Eastern Europe at the end of Cold War belonged to 1989's heartland states. As a matter of fact, this was the case also in 1918-1919 at the end of World War I, when those heartland states were renewed or newly came into existence. Any history of one or the other global moment, and this is the point I want to make, is unthinkable without Eastern Europe conceived as a global area. To sum up, in my talk, I first argued for a relativization, I don't know that this word doesn't exist in English, Relativisierung, of assumptions that the Western concept of three worlds during the Cold War was incompatible with Eastern's theory of a competition of capitalist and socialist world systems. Secondly, I focused on Eastern European perceptions of the manifold processes of colonialism and decolonization in the world outside Europe. Thirdly, I reflected on the position of Eastern Europe in the concept of global moments. In all three fields, in the systematic one of the world orders, the long term of colonization and decolonization, and the punctual of the moments. In all three fields, empirical evidence is to be found for the capacity of political, economic, scientific, as well as cultural actors to perceive, to make Eastern Europe both a globalized and a globalizing region. Any efforts to study the area in this direction will push back the old question as to how Western or how Eastern the region was, and will rather open new research avenues for, and this is the very title of this conference, Studying East and Southeast Europe as Area Studies under the Global Condition. Thank you.